He's the Director General of CII.
Mike.
Mr. Kamal Sibbal, who's the former Foreign Secretary of the Government of India. Ms. Shobna Kamineni, who's the Executive Vice Chairperson of Apollo and also the President of CII. The Honourable Minister is running slightly late. He's been caught up in an urgent parliamentary briefing. But let's get started. I think we have an exciting agenda to see how India did at Davos and take away some reflections from there. So welcome to Davos Darpan. We're going to share some reflections from Davos, get some questions from the audience. And we also have a very vibrant Twitter community which has shared some colorful and thought-provoking questions, which I'd love the audience to comment upon. But Mr. Banerjee, let's get started with you. What surprised you about Davos? What was different this time?
Well, I don't know if anything surprised me, but I was quite overwhelmed by the attention that India got in Davos. With 70 heads of states being present there, India getting the pride of place to open this annual session of the World Economic Forum was indeed a a position which is really much coveted. And all through, if you would have seen the type of presence that India sort of had across different sessions, across different topics, be it area of in the areas of demography, or be it in the area of jobs, be it in the area of reforms. It was India leading many dialogues at the World Economic Forum. And the type of spread that we saw, the red carpet that India was really putting out for the rest of the world, was indeed fascinating. So India was really on the high table. India was truly respected. The Prime Minister's speech, as all of us know, was really the high point and set the tone and agenda for the next few days. So it was more than surprising, it was overwhelming, if I could say, in terms of India's presence, and it was a very proud moment for all Indians in Davos during those few days.
I agree. Ms. Kamineni, what about you? You're a business leader. What were your highlights? What did you take away from the Prime Minister's speech?
Well, first, I think that apparently it was 20 years since it last snowed in Davos, and we got into an avalanche situation. And it was also 20 years since an Indian Prime Minister headlined Davos at the opening ceremony. So I think that those were quite unique events. But the lasting impression, avalanches come and go in that part of the world, but Narendra Modi doesn't. He leaves a lasting impression. And the lasting impression really was that here's a country that has thousands of years of history behind it, but we're rooted in the present, looking at the future. But we will move towards that with our own set of values and what we need to do best for India. And he outlined that quite, and at the end he got fairly philosophical, which I thought was nice. But he really strongly put forth his agenda, which this government has really pushed a new level of reforms for India, and it needs to be spoken to the world, because while the rest of the world seems to be, the theme was fractured, in a fractured world, a shared future. So he was saying that here's India, we're ready to share, we're ready to take that preeminent space, that to work with other countries, and we're not doing this alone, we can't do this alone. So come to India, we'll be part of the world also. So these were strong messages. He also spoke about the way that we should look at this fracture and some of the pain. We are, of course, I think, at a juncture in the world where everyone is re-evaluating their treaties, their trade treaties, their peace treaties, and actually seeing how they're going to work with the rest of the world. And so it was quite refreshing that the headline of that was someone who was ready to calm the world.
No, I mean, that's a great point. India with the world and India for the world. So, Mr. Sibbal, the theme of this year's Davos was creating a shared future in a fractured world. Ms. Kamineni walked us through some of her takeaways. But tell us, what is India's role in shaping the shared future? And how can India bridge these fractures that have appeared in the geopolitical landscape?
See, there are a couple of things I'd like to say. First, that there is now a developing concern in the Western world in particular that the international order is breaking down. And therefore, they are looking for predictability and stability and meeting the challenges that the international order is facing from what they see as authoritarian regimes. And they have identified China and Russia as two countries that intend to challenge the international order to suit their authoritarian needs. I don't agree with their identifying Russia as a factor, but I think China is a factor. And if you look at the national defense strategy of the United States announced just a few days ago, they are very open about China not only wanting to dominate the Indo-Pacific, but also replacing the United States as the preeminent power in the world. This is what they say textually. The second point I'd like to say is that Xi Jinping was in Davos last year, and he became the spokesman for globalization. He was trying to take full advantage of concerns that have arisen everywhere about Trump and America first, and his rejection of free trade agreements and decision to revise agreements that America has already signed, etc., generally anti-globalization trend. So therefore, it was very important for India, and I think the timing was very right for Prime Minister Modi to go to Davos and send a message, India's message, to the world in a situation where the world is feeling concerned and they have begun to look at India as independent of the opportunities India provides itself, as a stabilizing factor on the international stage in the context of China's rise. India's rise is not frightening anyone. China's rise is frightening the rest of the world, including Europe. And then, as was said, that he got the opportunity to speak at the opening plenary, which was a big honor, and he delivered a very powerful message. But with regard to what you mentioned about the fractured world, it was not simply fractures at the international level. He talked about fractures within, fractures in individuals and fractures within national societies. And he dwelled quite a lot of time on that. And that is the philosophical part of it. And he tried to convey the message that India has certain values which we have derived from our civilization and history, which are very different from the values of the rest of the world. And therefore, India can, in a sense, be the guru in terms of developing an alternative worldview and international governance. Now, whether we can achieve it or not achieve it, but he positioned India in a very particular niche, over and above economic opportunities and everything else, but also as a force for peace and prosperity in the world, in a collective endeavor, not in a fractured endeavor. And in that context, he outlined, in terms of international problems, terrorism and anti-globalization and climate change as issues of serious concern. So I would say, on the whole, he delivered a very powerful, complete message which went well beyond what the audience perhaps expected him to say.
Even the language was Hindi.
Yes, and in fact, he said, well, you know, one shouldn't look at the world as simply a competition between corporates. Yeah. He spoke about corporate social responsibility in that context also. So it was a very deftly delivered message, and I think it must have shaken up some of the CEOs who were there. That here's a man who's speaking with great confidence. He's speaking as a representative of an ancient civilization, which is now willing to be part of this world, but on the basis not of the traditions of the West, but very different traditions. That's why he said peace with prosperity or something.
Vasudeva.
No, he said wealth with health and
Yeah.
Right.
and some health with wealth with wellness and health with wholeness and peace with prosperity. I think this is not a kind of message which leaders of countries deliver to a business audience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mr. Banerjee, I mean, this Davos was talked about much before, I mean, these 3 or 4 days. There was Shah Rukh Khan at the Crystal Awards, the Honorable Prime Minister at the plenary. There were loads of CEOs, politicians, young leaders. But also prior to Davos, like CII was doing a lot of preparation. So walk us through, as much as you can tell, what did that preparation look like and how was it different from past years, if at all?
It was quite different. I mean, having been a CII participating in Davos for the last many decades, so to say, and as you just heard that, this was after 20 odd years that we have had a Prime Minister's presence. Therefore, if you look back 2006, 2011, we had some India presence that we had worked upon. But this was completely different. It was, if you look at the main promenade, which is the main walkway of Davos, it was full of India. There was an India lounge which was welcoming all communities, all countries to come to India. It was a mini India there, where you come, you taste Indian food, you can see get a glimpse of Indian culture, and then where you network to really, there is a B2B networking. There is also lots of government representatives from various parts of the world dropping in. You talk to them. So an understanding of India in that India lounge was quite evident. And quite strong by all those who dropped into that. So preparations for that to make it happen, Indian food available, getting the chefs out there, 130 odd Indian contingent, 130 plus Indian contingent going there. This time was indeed extraordinary. One of the largest after US. That's the. So and it was just not only business. It was business plus. It was business. It was government. It was, as you said, the 6th time that an Indian got a Crystal Award. So there was a lot of Indian culture around that. The main reception in Davos had to be opened by India. So it was India's reception. So preparations for that was very strong, to see a couple of thousand first-ranking delegates coming in from all over the world to an India reception. Leadership being taken, of course, by the government for that reception, and everybody plugged in to prepare. So it was a PPP of a different kind, the private sector working with the government's leadership to see that we put up a very grand first opening evening. The evening before the Prime Minister's address in the opening plenary was the India reception. There was another very business-like sort of approach taken. Again, I must give credit to the government which took that leadership, where they had a business center where they were facilitating interested investors into India. So there was one India lounge which was very informal. So there was one lounge which was very formal, where people come in, talk about how to invest in India, and you had Invest India officials, DIPP, really working on it. Our ministers having offices there. So they were transacting business in the heart of Davos with the rest of the world interested in investing or increasing their footprint with India. So preparations for that, connecting who the people are, inviting them for our events and our meetings. There was another very, very important and a powerful event which happens every year, but this year again was different, was a India reception that takes place. There are heads of states, ministers from various countries that drop in, and they mix with this 130 plus or Indians who are there, and that's a very important, nice, good Indian party that goes on in the evening. And that's an extremely strong networking platform and exchanging notes. So there's many things that happened this year in Davos which was very unique. And the preparations took close to about 6 to 7 months so in terms of getting resources together, human resources together, people together to execute it. Even Davos gets booked a year or two in advance, so seeing to it that we get the best positions. So India, everybody said we could see India, and it was a very strong cross-section of India, the government of India, the business of India, the non-business of India, the states of India. You had 2 chief ministers besides 5 union ministers. So that was a very, very powerful sort of a presentation of India which took a lot of preparations indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Another aspect which was energizing was to have an all-women co-chairs, and one of them was an Indian. So I think it was really energizing for me personally to see, all-women co-chair panel. I would love to get your thoughts of what it meant for you, and what are some of the ways in which your organization, let's say CI as a precedent, what are we doing to encourage entrepreneurship among women? So two-part question. One, what was that all-women co-chair signify? And second is like, what's CI's plan of action to encourage entrepreneurship among women?
I think it was a significant message that as much as there was one theme that was put out there of talking about a fractured world, the message that all the co-chairs were women, I think it was something extremely serious that the world will take note of, that every company that is a member of the World Economic Forum has taken note of, and of course governments, when you had Justin Trudeau actually spending an entire session talking about women empowerment. And I actually saw the panel of the 7 co-chairs, and each one of them had a unique perspective to their work. But what I really liked was when one of the co-chairs, who's the head of CERN is, it's based out of Switzerland, and it is the premier scientific research organization that is studying particle research. And she said, when people come in to CERN, we have the best scientists from almost every country in the world, and they're chosen just on meritocracy. So nobody knows which, they drop their nationality at the door, so this thing about a fractured nation, but they also drop their sex. I mean, who cares? If they're a man or a woman? Women know math and you qualify for it. And I thought that was just the most ideal example of how a perfect world would be, where it is on merit and everyone is treated equally. But we're a long way from that. Everybody shared their message. And I think that, but those that watched it, it was a very powerful signal of what will come. Because if you see today that one is there's a conscious effort that is being done for women to be joining the workforce, for women to be paid equally, for women, and they're speaking out. And it's very important that that voice is being heard. So for many years, the voice was not heard. I think that this Davos message is clearly about voice, and it's clearly about, justice, social justice. In India, it's also about economic justice, because if we can just get 10% of the women more into the workplace, this country will actually earn another $700 billion of GDP. It will also provide better per capita for families when you have this double income, both of them earning and working and raising their families. So this is the kind of, I think, a serious message that goes, and also for India. So CII has been actually working at 2 levels, which is important. Both levels are important. One is from 2005, we've had the Exemplar Awards. So the CII Exemplar Awards actually finds and rewards women entrepreneurs from across India, many of them from really struggling backgrounds, and all of a sudden they get recognition. Very often this award is given by the President of India, and also it helps in their future endeavors. But what we're trying to do is to mainstream. It's not just about one women exemplar that gets recognized, but it's about across sector by sector, district, village, everywhere, city. And these are the kind, of opportunities that we're encouraging, by putting this out there spoken about just before our AGM. We're really trying to tell companies that this is what you should do to be inclusive, to take this outside just your own company and move into the society, that participate and help this entrepreneurship for women. But apart from that, what CII is recognizing and doing is this very strong network of women, IWIN, that what we're doing is that women in the workforce really need the attention. They need to be, there are a separate set of needs that are required for them to be able to perform at peak performance.
I see.
And this is something that I think we're socializing a lot more.
This is really concrete, and I encourage everyone to take a look at this study that McKinsey has done.
Yes.
That looks at this, and also the global contribution of
I was in that study.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So I think gender parity is clearly something that we must focus on, because even today as we speak, only 25% of India's GDP comes from women, and I think we as a country can do much better to make that number up. And ma'am talked about how what it can do to our economic figures, but more importantly what it can give to the voices and to make India the choice of doing business, but also a place to be and be excited by.
Just to add, but just one point to add to what the CII president was talking about. The co-chair you said from India, the women co-chair,
Yeah.
she's a social entrepreneur.
Yeah. Actually, I should have said that. You're right.
Mandeshi Foundation.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. It's from the social sector,
Yeah.
and not just so, which itself is a very strong signal going out from India to the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, since we are on her, I mean, we bumped into each other several times, but also this time at the Zurich airport.
Yeah.
And like her passion for her work just, it comes out with everything that she says and stands for. So,
She was
absolutely.
very practical. Her
Yeah.
ideas were very practical. I told her that.
So she was also representing India at all forums and expressing and presenting us in a different light. So business, non-profit, as you mentioned, there's culture, food, everything. Yeah. But Mr. Sibal, coming back to, the fact that the world is fractured today isn't contested, but people say that it's also a multipolar, multicultural world. How can both of these statements be true? And I want you to put in perspective the comments made by all heads of states, because there were several at Davos. And what were some, how do we reconcile this difference?
Well, first of all, the world has always been fractured. I mean, the Cold War was what? Complete fracture. And then you had the unipolar world for a few years when a lot of grave mistakes were made, and you've seen the consequences of that. And we are still suffering from those consequences. And that created new fractures. The rise of the Islamic State and jihadi terrorism and everything else was a product of that. And now there is concern, as I said, that the world is fracturing again because America is seen as withdrawing from the world and not being the same kind of security provider and upholder of the international system as it was, because America has suffered a great deal from the mistakes it's committed, and its economy has suffered as a result too. And therefore Trump came with a very different thinking and approach about America's involvement with the rest of the world. Now this has created a lot of concern, especially in those countries which are dependent on the United States for their security. And coupled with China's rise and its geopolitical ambitions, which they have now overtly expressed.
And exercised.
There is a great deal of uncertainty around. So I think now, as I mentioned, the world is looking at India to be a part of the healing process. It's remarkable. Of course, we have difficult relations with China. But otherwise, if you look at the world at large, barring Pakistan, we have good relations with everybody. We have strategic partnerships with a whole lot of countries, and we have strategic partnerships with countries which are strategic adversaries. We have very good relations with the United States, we have very good relations with Russia, we have excellent relations with Israel now, but we have very good relations with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc., etc.
And the US.
US, of course, as I said.
Diplomatic magic.
So, therefore, that is one very important role India can play. The second is the role of India as a democracy, to which Prime Minister referred in his Davos speech. He didn't overstress it, but it's very important in the context of concerns about authoritarian trends in the world and the pushback that democracy is receiving at the hands of the couple of powers that I mentioned. The third is that people are getting very wary of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and because of China's assertive policies, there is now unwillingness to continue to invest. Not that the Chinese market has become unattractive, but it's not the same thing as before. They're looking for alternatives. And India provides an ideal alternative, huge market. IMF says growing at 7.2% this year, 7.7% next year, and they foresee an 8% growth in the medium term. And all the programs that we have, and Prime Minister listed what we are doing in terms of infrastructure building and other programs that he outlined in his speech. And he mentioned that there are huge opportunities in India and therefore come, and they would want to come. And he also cited figures about how FDI has increased a great deal in the last 3 years from what, 36 to 60 billion dollars. And as we are putting our act together, I think the opportunities for India to take advantage of the shift of manufacturing from China to other countries with lower wage structures can hugely benefit India. And on top of that, this should be underlined also, that in terms of the digital world, digital technology, India is a leader. India is a leader, even the United States, in the sense that most of the top the mega IT companies are now headed by Indians. So there's a big depth in terms of the potential of what India can do together with the United States and increasing with Europe and Japan and Southeast Asia in the digital world. And that strength of India is being recognized. I think everything is going for India, except that we are not, because of our political system, we are not able to do things as rapidly as, let's say, China can do. So there's a time lag. Yeah. And whether we can make our whole system more efficient in terms of decision making, though Prime Minister did say that India combines, what did he say, something with decisiveness, diversity with decisiveness. You know, he tried to give the message that I am decisive, my government is decisive, we'll move forward. And in some areas, certainly we have done that, but more needs to be done. In other words, in this fractured world, India, I think, presents a very attractive picture to the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, as Mr. Sibal pointed out, there's a question on Davos Darpan with this hashtag. I'm going to take that and also some questions from the audience. But now let's delve deeper into specific aspects. Somebody once remarked that the thing with emerging markets is they're always emerging, they never really emerge. Now, I hope that that doesn't happen to India. And it doesn't look like we're doing well on ease of doing business, FDI is working for us. But there are also many challenges to overcome. So let's start with you, Mr. Banerjee. CIA has been instrumental in developing the strong public-private partnership network, a framework of sorts. What really happens after Davos? What does CIA do after Davos? How does it follow up? What are the specific actions that it undertakes?
So there are many dimensions of Davos and post-Davos, many dimensions. One is the business dimension, the investment, following up on the leads as to which corporations are looking at India positively, how do they come in. Today there is a government, very strong government mechanism in, say, Invest India, which does the real linking up, the last mile, so to say. We do the general broadcast and also follow up to see whether they are, whether their interests are being well served, whether their questions are being well answered. So that's one business stream that we have. The second, there are a lot of cues that we pick up. Say, for instance, Industry 4.0, artificial intelligence, robotics, how different countries are looking at it, what's happening there, and then picking up those threads for India and learnings from there to develop an ecosystem over here. Learnings in terms of the positives and the negatives as to how the world has dealt with, so that we can sort of bring it down over here, and that's very, very critical. The third element is which actually Ambassador Sibal alluded to in a way. We talk about the success stories of India, like, say, for instance, our digital success story. And those are where we are talking about how India has leveraged some tech in terms of inclusivity. right, in including and widespread growth, making the growth more inclusive. When we talk about it in Davos, it also projects the type of business opportunity for the rest of the world to participate in this development process in India. So that again needs to be followed up on. So what are the opportunities existing on those ones, and which companies showed interest? How do we tie that up? There is I spoke about it in the beginning, but today one of the evolving features in a forum like Davos is the presence of states of India. And India is nothing but actually 29 mini Indias. It's so diverse and so different from one part of the country to the other. So each time there are about 3-4 states go. This time 2 chief ministers went, another one state IT minister went. Some of the states went quietly to observe what's going on. But they're all working on what type of investments they can attract. And these investments could be even attracting, say for instance, institutions for partnership. It could be an education institute for partnership. It could be any institutions of that kind that they really look at. So there are many leads that takes quite some time for us to close out on. Many learnings for which we need to come back to India and sort of apply. And many questions that are asked to India in terms of how India has succeeded. And we're learning from many other countries, many other emerging countries, so to say, which India really networks on for the post Davos.
Yeah, that's very well said. As the president of CII and a leader in healthcare space, you must be very energized by the healthcare budget. If yes, then what do you believe that some of the concrete actions that India can take to bridge the healthcare divide that exists in the country?
The Ayushman Bharat is the big one. That it done right, it will bridge that healthcare divide, because all of a sudden, you know that Obamacare was about 35 million people. This is about 500 million people, unprecedented scale, and it actually takes care of 40% of India. So first we have to identify that 40% which requires healthcare the most. And if we can, 5 lakhs is the figure that I think most of the audience here is probably what if they have an insurance, that's what they would take. So it's actually substantial. It would get them it would take care of their advanced medical needs for the household. So the amount is perfect, the vision is perfect, but the devil is in the details of execution. And I think that execution will really come from technology as the backbone, because we have to have the best-in-class technology, and I have great belief that India will put that together, that we can manage that. And then after that, we have to really create 2 things. One is prevention. A lot of this can be taken care of by prevention. You don't want people to get sick. You really don't want them to dip into that 5 lakhs, because then, your health bill will add up and add up and add up, and you'll be no different from the US and other struggling countries that have health bills. We only have, this year, after many years, they've allocated 2.5% of GDP. Otherwise, it was 1% or 1.5%. So it cannot inch up more than 3%. So for us, I think prevention is fundamental. Sanitation, malnutrition, all these have to be simultaneously addressed. And the second part of it is really, can we get, our cities have great healthcare, measurable to many of the advanced countries in terms of outcomes. But what we don't have is where most of the people currently are. The 40 million that are, the 500 million that are assured care are mostly in areas that have no care. And that is where we have to find those innovative solutions, whether it's telemedicine, whether it's setting up the rural clinics, whether it's augmenting the facilities that the government has, so there's no wastage and leakage. So there's multiple things that, I've just said it in terms of a broad character, but I do believe that this can happen, and much of it is already been thought through.
That's great. So just a quick follow-up. In the past few years, have you seen a tangible difference between where we were on healthcare and where we are today? Are we taking steps in the right direction?
Yeah, I think we are, because if you see that starting from prevention, we have this whole we have this whole mission on NCDs. So it hasn't been deeply, it hasn't, it's been thought through. It has not got scale. So I would like to see scale on that. The same thing in terms of malnutrition and fortification has been thought through, started, and I think that it will take time to scale. But the thing is that this government has really put their mind behind it. It's the same thing. Ayushman Bharat is another one of those. So I think that these nobody has really thought about health for a long time in India, and this is so important for our society to grow. You spoke about will we become, as we develop, will we actually become rich? Let me tell you, if we don't handle healthcare, we will always be poor. We cannot afford, if you have a health bill like the US, or if you're going to be spending, today we spend $100 per capita. The US spends $8,000, OECD spends $5,500. If we're anywhere in that, even if we go to $200-300, we're spending $500 billion out of 2.4 trillion. We can't afford that.
Yeah.
So I think that fundamentally we have to get these things straight, and the government gets it. That's the best thing.
No, that's heartening, because the NCD bill, NCD is going to be, so we looked at education, we looked at healthcare. Now let's come to security. I think that was mentioned in the Prime Minister Modi's speech, and the American president also had views on security. What is, like, in the coming year and a half, what are some of the major threats to international security you perceive, and what's India's role in mitigating them?
Well, Prime Minister highlighted the threat of terrorism. This is something about which the world is now increasingly concerned. Europe has suffered major terrorist attacks in their cities, and the periphery of Europe has been destabilized, whether it's Libya or Syria or Iraq, and that is generating two things. One, refugee flows, which have again destabilized Europe socially, plus augmented the threat of terrorism. The United States has also suffered from terrorist attacks, and they've become very now open and forceful with regard to dealing with Pakistan, for instance. At least in terms of what Trump has said, it gives a lot of hope that that today they are on the right lines with regard to what they see is the problem of Pakistan, but whether they'll follow it up with the concrete measures and begin a process of sanctions, that remains to be seen. I remain a little doubtful, but hopefully this will happen. So therefore, terrorism is a very major thing which Modi highlighted, Prime Minister Modi highlighted. Secondly, the whole issue of climate change. With America deciding to walk out of the Paris Agreement, there is a great deal of concern, because once United States gives up this commitment to the environment and to climate change issues, then the rest of the world will find it very difficult to sustain the Paris Agreement, and Prime Minister Modi has taken a lead in this, and in his Davos speech he underlined that. And this whole idea of building an international solar alliance and reliance more and more on solar energy, and he gave some figures about what we intend to do, not only in the realm of solar energy, where we now have 14, I think he mentioned some figure, 14 megawatts of electricity, which were gigawatts of electricity, which has grown from 3 in the last 3-4 years, plus 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, this and that. So this is a challenge that humanity is facing, right, which Prime Minister Modi has highlighted. And the third, of course, is the whole concern about anti-globalization. If the rest of the world, including the developed world, has become prosperous, it's because of globalization. It has its undersides, especially inequalities and everything else. But the fact also is that if you take a country like China, it will not be where it is today but for globalization. And we have benefited a great deal from globalization too, but because we have been slow in terms of taking advantage, as we are slow in so many other things, we've not been able to capitalize on this as much as China has been able to do. And now there are serious concerns in Europe and elsewhere that the anti-globalization trends and protectionist trends, because don't forget that Europe is essentially an exporting area. It depends a huge deal on exports. Therefore, they need open markets. They may be protectionist in some areas themselves, but they need an open trading system. And here again, Prime Minister Modi and India's interest, his interest and India's interest is to have an open trading system and open markets and no protectionism, because that will stall India's growth prospects.
Right.
So these are the kind of concerns that the world is facing and which Prime Minister Modi has highlighted. But let me just say one more point about Davos and inclusiveness. You know, like the G20, Davos in certain circles doesn't have a good name. That is the rich of the world getting together, and the rich are getting richer, and inequalities are increasing, and that is creating social problems in so many countries and problems between countries also. And therefore, the message of inclusiveness is very important, and Prime Minister mentioned inclusiveness and what India is trying to do to create an inclusive society. That was also a very positive message that went across.
Got it. No, thank you very much. I just want to do a quick time check to see where we are. I just want to take a few questions from the audience. Do we have time? Yeah, and then I'll go to the Twitter ones because our Twitter is buzzing as well with all. So the audience, over to you. Do you have one or two questions? So just please feel free to introduce yourself and ask a specific question.
Thank you. My name is Manis Patnaik. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a returning entrepreneur from the US. I was working with the Microsoft.
Could you be able to
I was working with the Microsoft. I returned back and I've started my own firm over here. My question is around, also to Chandrajit sir, about knowledge tourism. Can there be a scope for knowledge tourism development in India where we can bring in international folks? Because our even the management institutes are very top class over here. We have the best of the best institutes out here. Could there be some way that we can bring in here so that when they go back, they can also tell things about India, and that rapidly scales how we are developing and changes the dimension of thought that we have in the Western world about India?
So in some manner, it's in the corporate sector, we have started it in certain ways. Say, for instance, we've just come back. The President CII was leading a delegation to Singapore just couple of months back. So we came back and we signed a deal, and actually we have progressed a lot, where some Indian corporates are taking in a large number of actually students, just fresh graduates, interns from Singapore into several Indian companies around the country. And so it's a package deal for them, just for about a year or 6 months. And they see India, they understand how to work in corporates in India, what does working in India means, understanding Indian culture. And of course, they go back to their country. Some of them look at employment in India. Some of them go back as very good, strong ambassadors of India. So that it started in some way, and of course there's a huge opportunity of it being expanded in various forms in India. Again, it should be a PPP between the government, between the private sector, between institutions, which can play a huge role to see how we are able to have that type of traction.
Thank you. There was another question.
Can I just get into this? You're missing the real point. Who said best of the best? We hardly rank. And you can count on your fingers of what we have for 1 billion people. So I think that one thing that we have to not keep fooling ourselves that we have great education system. I think that all the bright people that we get, whether it's doctors, engineers, lawyers, come in spite of the system. So what we really need to do is build. And we should always recognize and not forget about that this is the fundamental, that if India needs to grow and this billion, of how we're going to move forward, We just have to change the way that we're all educated.
Yeah. Jack Ma touched upon it.
Huh?
How do you want to disrupt the education
Yeah,
systems?
there's so much we
Very
need
much.
to do.
Yeah. So there's a question there.
Thank you. My name is Nalin Kohli. A question for the whole panel. I was recently leading an Indian IT delegation in the US, and there is a recognition that India 2.0, the new India, as compared to China, is a better opportunity. But one question which came in all the meetings that I did was, what about IP? You know, doing some offshore work is one thing, but when they get into serious engagement, like Mr. Sibal mentioned on Digital India, their concern on IP was uniform across both the coast and Chicago. So I'm sure you'd be facing the same question. We say we have a very robust IPR system in our country, and there's nothing to fear about. But the perception still is that, you know, IP is a concern. We see it with the Israelis, we see it with the Americans, and level of interest is high, but I think this is one point which needs to be addressed. So I would like to have your comments on that.
So let's take a couple of more questions and try and address them together, if that's okay.
That's great.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions, any other comments?
I have one for the CII president. There was the Rashtriya Bima Yojana, which to my mind was a success story, which was something like the insurance thing. Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana.
RSBY.
That's right. So don't you think we have enough experience, we went through a learning curve, and this bigger program could really build on that?
That's exactly what they're doing. And in fact, the states have their own. So they've called them also for consultation. Andhra Pradesh does 1.79 crore people with 2 lakhs. Yashashwini, many states have it. So they've used all these. The learning is collective, that we're already, and that's the good story too, what you brought up. 300 million people in India have some form or shape, not all below the poverty line, are getting this state-sponsored insurance.
Great. So I just request, let's try and bring this to a close and to a logical conclusion. I do have a few closing remarks and I think explanations that I owe to the audience. But let's start with each of the panelists. Like if you were to sum up Davos 2018, one challenge, one opportunity, one takeaway. Would love to hear your closing remarks from all of you. Do you want to start? Or do you want to start? Up to you, popcorn style.
Ladies first.
It was my first interaction, so one of the things is that I do think that there is continuing value in Davos in terms of fresh minds that are discussing important issues. And wherever that is, the more people that are engaged, whether it's online or live, it's something that will broaden everybody's mindset. So that was my big takeaway, that just the quality of discussions is something that the world needs to continue the discussions on. And the challenges, I do think that that many world leaders tripped through Davos this year because of more in terms of their own self-interest that they needed to be there. We're still not talking in terms of a bigger world picture, and maybe there should be more platforms that are addressing these things. So this thing has to be, it's a reality that governments today are very different from the way they were two years ago, or even. And I think so moving forward into the future, what's going to happen. And the last is that I think that Davos has the World Economic Forum has recognized that technology will be a huge driver, and they're working on Industry 4.0. So they're actually trying to look ahead of the curve, and most important, they're trying to be more inclusive, because it should not be so elitist. It actually gives, it makes people very reluctant to be seen there.
Right. No, thank you.
See, on the IPR issues, we've been under pressure from the United States for a long time. Nothing new. What surprises me in all this is that the biggest theft of American U.S. IP intellectual property rights comes from China, and yet look at the trade and investment figures between U.S. and China. Here in India's case, because of our Patents Act and in the pharmaceutical area, certain decisions were taken that this has become a very big issue. Otherwise, I have not seen any great evidence apart from this area, pharmaceuticals, where there is a lot of argument in favor of what we are doing, and what our patent tax is totally compatible with the World Trade Organization. I have not seen any evidence of any theft of US intellectual property. In any case, there is a bilateral group that was set up, and in that group this issue is being addressed, and Prime Minister in his Davos speech actually referred to India giving a sense of confidence to the people that he was speaking to, that India is very serious about protecting IPRs. But the American companies, a couple of them who are pushing the Congress and the US business, whatever it is called, IBC, they'll continue to push us because why not? These are tactics that they will pursue. Insofar as Davos is concerned, look, we have a lot of bilateral engagement with our key partners, and this is over so many years. We open special windows for so many countries, the US or Japan or whatever else, in terms of facilitating the investments in these countries. And there are a whole lot of other agencies and banks and who are looking at the Indian economy, the investment groups and all, looking at the Indian economy, studying it. They know what the positives are, what the negatives are. Davos is simply a platform for sending a signal. It is an element of publicity in this, but the hard work and the reality of decision making by the people that we are addressing will come afterwards. So Davos should not be seen as some kind of a magic wand, where once we deliver a message, then the gates of foreign investment into India will open. I think it was more in the nature of signaling, sending a positive message, and for people who have not had access to Mr. Modi personally, to hear him personally and gauge him, size him up, see how sincere, how committed he is, because all these do leave impressions. But at the end of the day, the decisions will be made in boardrooms after they go back and then have a look at the actual prospects.
Which is why I asked Mr. Banerjee.
So I'll take the lead from the last point that Ambassador Sipal talked about. India has been great over the last many years on lots of promises made about what we are going to be and what are the changes that we are going to make to our society, to make it different, how will it be different in India. So lots of promises every time that we go there. And the reality checks have been quite contrary to what the promises have been. If we look at, and we were talking about our Prime Minister's speech, in the initial part of the speech, he talked about some of the three top global issues. But if you look at the second half of the speech, it was quite a lot of outcomes as to what has India achieved, what have we done. So it was really talking about not what we will be doing, but more of what we have done. And that's the path that we are going to take. And that's a very strong message, because that a lot of credibility revolved around that of India, that India has actually made it. When we talk about ease of doing business or many other things which we have talked about in this panel, see, the outcomes were strong. So there was a huge sort of a delivery in front of credibility and walking the talk as far as India was concerned. So that's very comforting, very strong signal going out. The second one is which we can encash on from Davos, and I guess that we will be able to do it very strongly, is the indication that went out that India's growth is benign. I mean, unlike the growth of some countries which are not so benign. So that particular aspect of and message going out with strong sort of content in it, so strong sort of reasoning in it, is an important signal at this point in time to go around to the rest of the world. And my last point would be the competitiveness and the of Indian firms. One of the things that we both of us, Shobna and I, were discussing, and she said that it was so great to see in Davos, as you walking the streets of Davos, suddenly you see a Wipro, you suddenly you see a TCS, suddenly you see Indian firms, Infosys around. So it's a domination of Indian firms, and Indian firms have come out of age. They are globally, but they're just not only in India, but they have global footprints, which itself is a huge, strong signal of what we have done coming from talking on behalf of the business community. I think that's a very, very strong message, which has far-reaching implications for India in a global community like Davos.
Great. Thank you very much to the panelists. Now, the Honourable Minister has actually been held up because of something critical in the Parliament. So there were some specific questions that were directed to him. So I don't think there's we don't need to take them now. But thankfully, because of all your points, we have covered a lot of the Twitter questions that came from Ajay Sriram, Sanjay Budhia, Anshuman Rath, and several others. Thanks very much to the audience. Today we covered a whole bunch of subjects, like the core pillars that, like health and education and skilling, that are at the core of the Indian democracy. Plus also the aspects of storytelling and what does international relations, what are symbols and signs that, that Davos means, and more importantly, what happens after, because Davos is a 4-day culmination of various things, 6-7 months of hard work just from India. But I think the real work also starts after Davos, so and that means for each of us to do whatever we can to the best of our abilities. And thanks very much for joining in person and via all social media channels. Thank you very much.
Thank you.